I want to tell you a story, a very brief story, about how a denomination known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church came to be. The African Methodist Episcopal Church came to be because of an incident that occurred at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church. I can't remember the date exactly, but it was toward the beginning of our nation and our denomination's history. At St. George Methodist Episcopal Church, it's in Philadelphia, as a matter of fact, there's a balcony, like the one we have here, but actually very unlike the one we have here. Because the balcony at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church in that time period was reserved for those who were not white. St. George Methodist Episcopal Church was a segregated church. And the white and the wealthy would sit on the floor, and those people of color that were part of that community of faith would sit in the balcony. When they served communion at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church, the white people would come to the altar railing first and receive communion. And then those in the balcony would come to receive communion. Well, one day, a group of black men, including a man named Absalom Jones and another man named Richard Allen, came to the communion rail first. They kneeled there to pray and to receive the sacrament. And of course, you know how the story ends. Everything was fine and they were welcomed with open arms. That's not how the story ends. They were forcibly removed from the altar railing. Forcibly removed from the presence of Jesus by the leaders of the church. That event spurred into motion a number of things. One of the things that happened as an aftermath of that event is that Absalom Jones became the first ever African American priest of the Episcopal Church. That event in the Methodist Episcopal Church drove him away from Methodism altogether. He found a home amongst our Anglican brothers and sisters, now the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And he was welcomed by them and ordained as a priest, the first black priest in America in the Episcopal Church. Richard Allen was offered the same invitation. Richard Allen was invited to become part of the Episcopal Church, was offered ordination as a priest in that church. But Richard Allen was so committed to the Methodist ideals that he had learned from his youth, he saw no way of being faithful to his own theological commitments and points of view as anything other than a Methodist. And so he began the African Methodist Society in Philadelphia, which eventually became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. To this day, at the conference gatherings of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, they reenact that event. The forcible removing of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and several others as part of the recounting of their own denominational history and story. I'm delighted to tell you that the United Methodist Church, 2 or 3 years ago, entered into a full communion agreement with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and 2 or 3 other historically African American Methodist groups. I'm delighted that barring from the Lord's table has been reversed, and that now as a church we are in full communion with those groups. But those groups would never have existed were it not for the distortion of the gospel that a white supremacist and white nationalist worldview causes. Those groups only exist because of hatred and racism. As I said last week, these ideologies, white supremacism, white nationalism, racism, all of these things are demonic. They are spiritual forces of wickedness that we reject in our baptism, but they are spiritual forces of wickedness that seek the ruin of souls. You know, the devil is a roaring lion who prowls the earth, seeking the ruin of souls. That is what these ideologies are. When they creep in, they cause discord and division, just as what happened at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church all those years ago. Jesus doesn't desire a church that is split apart by identity. Jesus desires a church that is united in the one identity that we share, that usurps all other commitments and identities we might foster. And that is our baptismal identity as those who are reborn in union with Jesus. The end. Paul writes about this over and over again in Galatians. We hear it echoed in this Romans reading that we heard this morning. Paul says in Romans, everyone is alike in their need for salvation. And Jesus saves equally. Everyone stands in need of the grace of God revealed in Jesus Christ. And when we accept that grace, when we are plunged into the baptismal waters, or have the baptismal waters poured over our head or sprinkled, or however it happens, the old is washed away, and we become new creations in Jesus. We've been hearing a lot about identity politics, especially in the last couple of weeks, but really for the last several years. Identity politics has become part of the national conversation in a way that is anything but healthy. We are so wrapped up in all of these polarizations that split us apart into increasingly tiny subgroups, such that we cannot often even recognize the personhood of those with whom we share no common identity or ideology. That is not what Jesus has for us. That's not the church Jesus desires us to be. We are called in our baptism into union with Jesus. And when we are in union with Jesus, we are then in union with every other believer in Jesus, in all times, in all places, of all nations and races. One in Jesus. Not separated, not segregated, but one in Jesus. Jesus confronts this reality head on in the gospel reading this morning. I love this story of Jesus. In fact, I thought about entitling this message, which I don't typically put titles on my sermons, but I thought if I was going to title this sermon, I would title it, Jesus Confronts His Own Privilege. Or if I was going to do it in the vernacular, Jesus Checks His Privilege. Or if I was going to be even cooler, I'd say, Jesus Gets Woke. I love this story because here we get a glimpse into Jesus beginning to completely understand His own mission from the Father. Now, Jesus is fully God, fully divine, but Jesus is also fully human. And here in this gospel lesson, we get a glimpse of the humanity of Jesus as He encounters an incident as he encounters a person who calls into question some of his own human preconceptions and gives him the opportunity to more fully understand his own mission from the Father. This story begins with Jesus just trying to get some rest. It seems like a lot of stories in the Gospels begin with Jesus trying to get away. As a pastor, I find that very comforting that even Jesus sometimes had a hard time getting a day off. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He's trying to get away from the crowds. He's wanting some solitude. Why is he wanting some solitude? Not just because he's tired, although that's true, but he wants an opportunity to reflect on what his mission is becoming. He is contemplating what comes next. He's beginning to turn his face toward the cross. And he needs time to process, to reflect on what this means for him. And he also needs time alone with his disciples to explain to them what's about to happen and prepare them for what comes next. So Jesus is looking for some alone time for his own spiritual rejuvenation, his own reflection, his own growth, but also for the sake of his disciples, to teach them more about what's happening and what's about to happen. But as he walks along, there is this Canaanite woman. That's 2 strikes for those of you that are keeping score at home. Canaanite, not Israelite, so not a person of the covenant community. So strike 1, she's a Canaanite. Strike 2, she's a woman. And as many of you probably already know, in ancient Near Eastern culture and even in some modern Middle Eastern cultures, men and women do not intermingle. They do not interact. And so here is a Canaanite woman who is breaking all sorts of social barriers, violating all sorts of taboos by calling out, yelling at an Israelite man. But what she says is amazing. She says, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." When she calls out to Jesus for help, she calls out as one who recognizes him for who he really is. The Messiah, the Son of God, the one sent to bring salvation into the world. She recognizes him for who he is, something his own disciples have not yet done. The confession of Peter doesn't happen until the next chapter. His own disciples haven't even recognized him as Messiah. And this Canaanite woman, this complete outsider, recognizes him for who he is. And I love these next few verses because we get to see a little peek into Jesus' psyche. As she calls out to him, asking for help, Jesus did not answer a word. He's taken aback. He falls silent as he tries to understand what is happening here. Here is a woman, not of the covenant community, a woman completely outside the ranks of Israel, who is calling him for who he really is. And so he stops, he falls silent. And of course, his disciples, always very helpful. Yeah. They say, "Jesus, just send her away. She is crazy annoying." And then Jesus says this really strange thing. And if you read this next couple of verses one way, it almost sounds like Jesus is rejecting her. He says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman is undeterred. She says, "Please help me, help me." And then he says, "Is it right? It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Now, on the surface, if we read these couple of verses, 23 and 24, it can seem as if Jesus is completely rejecting this woman and that she kind of has to twist his arm. But there is an alternative way to read these verses, and it has to do with punctuation. So I'm going to get a little nerdy here for just a second. But in the Greek, there is no such thing as punctuation. Punctuation is to be inferred in Greek texts from the context. So there are a couple of ways actually to read what Jesus says. You can read it this way with a period, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Or you can read it this way. Was I sent only to the lost sheep of Israel? You can read, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Or you can read, is it all right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs? When you translate the Greek with that punctuation, you get a completely different way of thinking about what this text can mean. Perhaps this is Jesus having a little internal discussion as he encounters this surprising woman. I mean, utterly surprising that a woman who is not a Jew would be able to say, Jesus, Messiah, have mercy on me. He encounters this surprising woman, and he falls silent at first. And his disciples, they're always trying to make sure that they're getting rid of everyone that needs Jesus' help, try to push her away. But Jesus falls silent and begins to reflect. And you can almost imagine Jesus kind of having this sort of monologue, maybe even half aloud. Was I sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Would it be all right for me to help this woman? Is this part of my mission? Because Jesus knew and understood that he was the Messiah, the one who was sent to save Israel, the ultimate fulfillment of God's covenant promise to Abraham. Through your family, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Jesus knew that to be true, and so he knew his mission was intrinsically tied up in Israel. But he also knows that Abrahamic promise, through your family, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so Jesus, as he encounters this woman who is from some of those nations of the world that aren't Israel, asks himself, am I only sent to Israel? My mission might be even larger than I initially understood it to be. Jesus encounters the grandness of what God has called him to do, that his mission is not only for the sake of Israel, but through Israel it is for the sake of all the world. This woman calls out to Jesus as an outsider, as an other, as one whose identity has nothing to do with Jesus' own ethnic and national identities. And Jesus, in faithfulness to God, turns to this woman and accepts her as one who confesses Jesus as Lord. Just a few verses before this story happens, Jesus has an argument with some Pharisees. They're getting really upset with Jesus about his personal hygiene habits. They don't like the way he's washing his hands and the way his disciples are washing or not washing their hands. And Jesus says something very interesting to the Pharisees. He says, it's not what goes in a person's mouth that defiles him. It's what comes out of a person's mouth that makes him clean or unclean. The thing that comes out of our mouth to make us clean is the confession that Jesus is Lord. If you believe in your heart and confess with your voice that Jesus is Lord, that's where salvation lies. If you believe in your heart and confess with your voice that Jesus is Lord, that's where salvation lies. And that is what this Canaanite woman does. She believes and confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was sent to bring salvation to Israel and through Israel to all the world. Her identity is not important. Her ethnicity is not important. Her nationality is not important. Her status is not important. What matters is that she confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the one sent by God to bring salvation to all the world. If we believe in Jesus, then we are called into this same ministry to all the world, to all those who come to us, to all those whom we encounter. There's no such thing as white supremacist Christianity. There's no such thing as nationalist Christianity. There is only the body of believers who have been plunged through the waters of baptism, who have in their baptism been united to Jesus and his sacrifice, and who now take on the identity of Christ. There is no other identity. The Christian life is to be lived in union with Christ. And the goal, the purpose, the end of the Christian life is to be made one with God, to be made like Jesus. That's what we do. That's who we are. That's our identity. Perhaps today can be a day that, just like Jesus confronted his own privilege, Jesus confronted his own status, Jesus confronted his own nationality and ethnicity in the face of the other, perhaps today can be a day for us to do the same. When that day came for the folk of St. George Methodist Episcopal Church, they chose identity, nationality, and ethnicity over the Jesus identity that they were given in baptism. We have that same choice to make in all of our encounters. And my prayer for all of us is that we'll be like Jesus. And we will accept and embrace the other, regardless of race, nationality, status. Embrace the other and offer the love of God and the healing that Jesus brings. That's my prayer for us. It's my prayer for me. May we all accept and embrace the identity Jesus has given us. And through that identity be in ministry to all the world. Amen.